In June of 2014, a young couple from Phoenix, Arizona vanished without a trace during their honeymoon trip to Miami, Florida. Matthew Carter, 28, and his wife Jessica Miller, 25, had meticulously planned this journey for months, saving every dollar to celebrate their recent marriage with a romantic escape to the beaches of Miami. But what was supposed to be a week of happiness turned into a nightmare that would baffle authorities in two countries for nearly a decade. On June 18, 2014, after 4 full days without any communication, U.S. authorities entered their hotel room. Everything was intact. Their passports sat on the nightstand, their suitcases were untouched, and their phones had been switched off the night before. There were no signs of a struggle, no ransom notes, no explanation at all. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. 8 years later, in April of 2022, Jessica reappeared, walking through the streets of San Diego, California, holding the hand of a boy who looked about 7 years old. She was frail, with long, tangled hair and worn-out clothes. Her eyes carried the hollow stare of someone who had witnessed things no one ever should. When the authorities finally identified her, her first words were chilling. "My son needs to be safe." Matthew can't come back." What had happened during those 8 silent years? Where had Jessica been? Who was the terrified boy she carried with her? And the question that froze the blood of every investigator: what had become of Matthew Carter? Before we continue with this disturbing case, if you value real-life mysteries like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. And tell us in the comments which city and state you're watching from. We're always curious to see where our community is spread across the world. Now, let's uncover how it all began. To understand the magnitude of this case, we need to go back to the beginning, to the life Matthew and Jessica lived in Phoenix before their fateful trip to Miami. Matthew Carter grew up in the Garfield neighborhood, a working-class community in central Phoenix. The oldest of 3 siblings, he started working at 16 to help support his family. By 2014, at age 28, he was employed as a supervisor for a logistics company handling freight shipments between the U.S. and Mexico. It was honest but demanding work that kept him traveling frequently between Phoenix, Los Angeles, and the Texas border towns. Jessica Miller, meanwhile, was born and raised in the Sunny Slope district of Phoenix. Her parents owned a small clothing store in a local strip mall, and Jessica studied accounting at Arizona State University before joining a small firm that specialized in helping family-run businesses. She was reserved but determined, known for her meticulous eye for detail and her ability to untangle complex financial problems. They met in 2011 at a downtown coffee shop. Matthew had stopped in for a quick espresso between client meetings, only to accidentally spill his drink onto the documents Jessica was reviewing at the next table. What started as an awkward apology turned into a 2-hour conversation about music, travel, and dreams for the future. Matthew was drawn to Jessica's intelligence and determination, while she was charmed by his humor and the genuine way he wanted to know her thoughts and opinions. Their relationship grew slowly but steadily. Matthew was the kind of man who believed in doing things the right way. He asked Jessica's father for permission to court her, introduced her to his family 6 months into their relationship, and waited nearly 2 years before proposing. His proposal was simple but heartfelt. During a walk through Papago Park, he knelt beside the lagoon and offered her a ring he had been saving for over months. The wedding took place on March 15, 2014, at St. Mary's Parish in downtown Phoenix. It was a traditional ceremony followed by a lively reception with family, friends, music, and dancing late into the night. The newlyweds decided to postpone their honeymoon, saving carefully to afford the trip of their dreams. 1 week in Miami, Florida, for a hard-working middle-class couple. Miami wasn't just a vacation, it was a milestone, a symbol of everything they had worked for together. Matthew picked up weekend shifts and Jessica took on extra accounting clients, every dollar saved going toward that one special trip. The plan was simple but well thought out. Fly from Phoenix to Miami on June 14, 2014, stay at a South Beach hotel for a week, visit the tourist spots, enjoy the beaches, and return home on June 21st to resume their new life together. Their flight left Sky Harbor International Airport on time. Airline records confirmed their checked luggage and paperwork were in perfect order. Fellow passengers later recalled the young couple looking cheerful and excited, taking photos and chatting about their plans for the coming days. They landed at Miami International Airport at 6:47 p.m. local time. Immigration records confirmed they cleared customs without issue, and a yellow taxi took them to the Beacon Hotel on Collins Avenue, just a short walk from the famous Ocean Drive. The hotel clerk, David Richardson, later remembered how exhausted yet visibly thrilled they seemed to finally be in Miami. For the first 3 days, Matthew and Jessica behaved like any other tourists. They walked South Beach, shopped along Lincoln Road, dined in Cuban restaurants, and sent family photos back home through WhatsApp and Facebook. Their posts painted a picture of a couple blissfully enjoying their delayed honeymoon. Hotel staff described them as model guests, polite, orderly, never causing trouble. But what neither their families in Arizona nor U.S. authorities knew was that Matthew and Jessica had caught the attention of dangerous people operating in Miami's shadows who saw in young, innocent tourists not human beings, but opportunities. The shift from paradise to hell was about to begin, and neither of them had the faintest idea what awaited. June 17, 2014, would be the last full day of their lives as they knew them. By the following morning, Matthew Carter and Jessica Miller would no longer exist in the documented world. Just names on missing persons files and photos on posters their families would hang in every corner of Phoenix. Wednesday, June 18, 2014, dawned hot and humid in Miami, as summers there always are. Records show temperatures reaching 89 Fahrenheit with nearly 80% humidity. For Matthew and Jessica, who were used to the dry heat of Arizona, the sticky air was draining but still thrilling, part of the exotic adventure they had dreamed about. Hotel security footage shows them leaving room 412 at 9:23 a.m. Jessica wore a turquoise sundress and golden sandals, while Matthew had on a white linen shirt, shorts, and sneakers. Both wore hats against the sun and carried a small backpack with water, sunscreen, and their cameras. At the front desk, they asked the concierge about the best breakfast spots near the beach. Esteban Valdez, a Cuban-born concierge, suggested a small cafe nearby known for its pastries and strong coffee. The last footage of them at the hotel shows them leaving hand in hand at 9:31 a.m., heading south along Collins Avenue. By 9:45, they arrived at the cafe. Their waitress, Maria Vega, remembered them clearly. She later told investigators that the couple seemed in perfect spirits, ordering Cuban coffee, buttered toast, and guava pastries. They pored over a tourist map while laughing together, Matthew snapping photos of Jessica as she giggled. When they left at 10:20, Matthew placed a protective hand on her back and tipped generously. Security cameras along Ocean Drive caught them strolling southward, stopping occasionally for photos in front of the Art Deco hotels. At 11:15 a.m., cameras placed them in Lummis Park. An ice cream vendor, Robert Torres, recalled selling them coconut cones and watching them sit under palm trees to enjoy the ocean view. Matthew even asked him in broken English about snorkeling tours. That question would later prove crucial, explaining why the couple turned north up Collins Avenue toward the pier where such tours departed. The final clear images of Matthew and Jessica appear at 12:47 p.m. Surveillance shows them walking north, Matthew's arm around Jessica's shoulders, following handwritten directions he carried in his free hand, directions someone had given them to reach the pier. After 12:47 p.m. on June 18, 2014, they vanished. No more camera footage, no witnesses, no credit card transactions, no phone calls, nothing. At 3 p.m., Jessica was supposed to call her mother in Phoenix, as she had every day since arriving in Miami. A quick check-in, a 5-minute routine that reassured her family. But the call never came. At first, her mother, Dolores Miller, assumed they were busy sightseeing. But when night fell and the usual bedtime call also failed to arrive, a knot of dread began to twist in her stomach. Meanwhile, at the Beacon Hotel, the cleaning staff noticed something strange. The couple hadn't returned to their room all afternoon. It was unusual because on previous days they had always come back between 2 and 4 p.m. to rest and freshen up before heading out again for the evening. Carmen Flores, a housekeeper from El Salvador, casually mentioned to her supervisor that the guests in room 412 hadn't been in all day. By the morning of Thursday, June 19th, there was still no sign of Matthew or Jessica. Their bed hadn't been slept in. Their suitcases remained exactly as they'd left them the day before. Their phone sat on the nightstand, completely powered off. Hotel manager Michael Stevens, a seasoned professional with 15 years of experience running hotels in South Beach, began to feel a growing unease. He had seen almost everything in his line of work, but something about this didn't feel right. At 10 a.m., Stevens made the call to Miami Beach police. He didn't take the decision lightly. In most missing guest cases, there were simple explanations. Sometimes people stayed with friends, switched hotels, or extended their trips without notice. But his instincts told him this case was different. Officer Daniel Martinez was the first to respond. A 12-year veteran of Miami Beach Police, he had handled hundreds of missing persons reports, most resolved within 24 hours. But when he entered room 412, he immediately knew this wasn't routine. Everything was too orderly. Normally, he would later recall, when people leave voluntarily, they take at least some things. But here, everything looked like they were coming back in just a few hours. The toothbrushes were still damp. Towels were hanging to dry. Dirty clothes sat in the hamper. It was as if their routine had been interrupted mid-stride. What struck Martinez most, though, were the passports left neatly on the nightstand, alongside their credit cards, Arizona driver's licenses, and about $800 in cash. In his experience, no one abandons their identity documents voluntarily, especially not in a foreign city. The case was immediately escalated to the Miami Beach Detective Bureau. Lead investigator James Morrison, a veteran with over 20 years working missing persons cases, took charge. He had handled everything from runaway teens to tourists who'd fallen prey to violent crime. His first move was to request all available security footage within a 10-block radius of the Beacon Hotel. For the next 3 days, Morrison and his team combed through more than 200 hours of recordings from hotels, shops, restaurants, and traffic cameras. They successfully tracked Matthew and Jessica from the moment they left the hotel until their last confirmed sighting at 12:47 p.m. on Collins Avenue. After that, it was as though they had evaporated. Meanwhile, their families back in Phoenix were spiraling into panic. Matthew's father, Anthony Carter, a mechanic, mortgaged his house to pay for an emergency trip to Miami and personally help with the search. Jessica's mother, Dolores Miller, contacted the U.S. State Department and launched a frantic social media campaign to spread photos of the missing. Coupled on, the State Department assigned Consular Officer Richard Nunez as liaison between the families and U.S. authorities. With 8 years of experience handling similar cases, Nunez immediately recognized disturbing signs. What worried me most, he would later say, was the combination of factors: young tourists, little international travel experience, carrying cash, in an area where we knew criminal networks were targeting vulnerable visitors, and their behavior up until that day had been consistent, predictable, and responsible. They weren't the type to disappear voluntarily without telling anyone. The investigation escalated when Morrison uncovered something chilling in traffic camera footage. At 12:52 p.m., just 5 minutes after the couple's last confirmed sighting, a white van with no visible plates appeared, moving slowly down Collins Avenue in the same direction Matthew and Jessica had taken. That van would become a critical lead and an enduring frustration. Despite expanding the search to every traffic camera across Miami-Dade County, investigators never managed to capture a clear image of its license plate or occupants. The van seemed to have been driven deliberately along routes that avoided the city's most advanced cameras. On June 25th, a week after the disappearance, Miami Beach authorities held a press conference to ask for public help. Photos of Matthew and Jessica appeared on every local news channel, and a hotline was set up for tips. The response was overwhelming, but discouraging. Dozens of calls, all false leads or mistaken identities. As U.S. investigators ran out of local options, the families refused to sit idle. Anthony Carter hired a private investigator, Raul Sanders, who had experience with cross-border cases. Sanders arrived in Miami 2 weeks after the disappearance and began his own parallel investigation, focusing on details the police might have overlooked. With years of background working human trafficking cases along the U.S.-Mexico border, Sanders immediately recognized familiar patterns. The suddenness of the disappearance, the complete absence of any trace after a specific point, and the couple's profile, young tourists with cash, unfamiliar with the area, were hallmarks of organized abductions. This wasn't opportunistic, Sanders would later explain. The networks that operate in Miami have precise methods for identifying and seizing potential victims. They target tourists who look like they have money but no local connections. People who can vanish for days before anyone raises alarms. Matthew and Jessica fit the profile perfectly. Despite the combined efforts of detectives and private investigators, the case slowly grew cold. The first 6 months were intense, filled with leads, interviews, and the hope they might be found alive. But after a year, the investigation was downgraded to open inactive, still technically active, but no longer receiving dedicated resources unless significant new evidence emerged. For the families in Phoenix, though, the search never ended. Each day without news was another wound, but also fuel for determination. They refused to accept that their children had simply disappeared without a trace. Somewhere, someone had to know what really happened on June 18, 2014, on those sunlit streets of Miami Beach. The months following Matthew and Jessica's disappearance completely reshaped their families' lives. What began as a dream vacation had become an endless nightmare, a limbo of grief and uncertainty that scarred each family member in profound ways. Anthony Carter, once a strong and optimistic mechanic, visibly aged in weeks. He became obsessed with one mission: finding his son. He mortgaged his auto shop, drained his life savings, and turned his living room into an improvised command center filled with Miami maps, photographs, police reports, and witness statements. His wife, Grace, coped differently. While Anthony poured himself into external action, Grace retreated into an obsessive domestic routine, as if keeping everything unchanged might somehow bring Matthew back. His bedroom stayed exactly as it was. Clothes folded, books stacked neatly, toothbrush untouched. Matthew's younger brothers, Daniel, 24, and Michael, 22, each responded in their own way. Daniel, who had always looked up to Matthew, took on extra jobs to help support the family and often accompanied his father to Miami. Michael, the youngest, withdrew emotionally, dropping out of college and struggling with insomnia and depression. Jessica's family carried the weight in equally devastating ways. Her mother, Dolores, transformed into a tireless activist, organizing marches, speaking to media outlets, and building networks with other families of the missing. Her clothing shop, once steady income, began to decline as every ounce of her energy shifted into the search for her daughter. Jessica's father, Benjamin Miller, took a more pragmatic approach, forcing himself to keep the family business afloat to fund the ongoing search. Yet each customer he served came with the gnawing question: where is my daughter right now? Jessica's younger sister, Patricia, then 21 and studying nursing, suffered deeply. The trauma disrupted her studies and strained her relationships. She had been extremely close to Jessica, and the sudden loss left her feeling guilty and adrift. Why didn't I insist on going with them to Miami? She often asked herself. Why didn't I warn them it was dangerous to travel alone to a city they didn't know? For the first 3 years, the search remained active at different intensities. Anthony Carter traveled to Miami 8 times between 2014 and 2017, each trip fueled by hope for new leads, each return more disheartened but no less determined. Along the way, he built a network of other families of the missing, community activists, and private investigators. One of his strongest connections was Elena Rodriguez, a Puerto Rican mother whose own son had vanished in Miami under similar circumstances 2 years earlier. Elena had become a skilled advocate, helping families navigate the U.S. legal system and keeping pressure on local authorities not to close cases entirely. Through Elena, Anthony learned something officials had never directly told him. Miami Beach had a serious, largely unspoken problem with criminal networks that specialized in abducting young tourists. These networks were sophisticated, well-connected, and operated across South Florida, Latin America, and the Caribbean. It's no coincidence, Elena told him during one of his trips. So many young tourists don't just disappear. The local authorities don't talk publicly about it because tourism is the lifeblood of Miami's economy. But the families who've lost loved ones, we know there's a pattern. We know there are organizations out there preying on people exactly like our children. This information was both clarifying and terrifying for Anthony. On one hand, it gave him a logical framework for what might have happened to Matthew and Jessica. On the other, it forced him to confront the possibility that his children had been targeted by professional criminals with resources and international connections, which made finding them vastly more difficult. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, both families were struggling not only with the emotional toll but with the financial burden of sustaining an international search. Flights to Miami, private investigators, translations of legal documents, and attorneys specializing in cross-border cases created enormous expenses that quickly drained both families' savings. In 2016, 2 years after the disappearance, Anthony was forced to sell his auto shop just to keep the search alive. Jessica's family had to close their clothing store and move into a smaller home to cut costs. These financial blows added crushing stress to families already carrying an unbearable emotional weight. Their community rallied with remarkable solidarity during the first years. Neighbors, co-workers, and church members organized fundraisers, awareness marches, and social media campaigns to keep attention on the case. Matthew and Jessica's story became a local symbol of how vulnerable travelers can be and of the need for stronger consular support. But, as often happens, public attention faded after the third year. Local media stopped covering the case regularly. Fundraisers became less frequent, and daily life slowly reorganized itself around the couple's continued absence. For the families, however, there was no such normalization. Every meaningful date became a painful reminder: Matthew's August birthday, Jessica's November birthday, their March wedding anniversary, and especially June 18th each year, the day they vanished. Those dates reopened the wound as if the disappearance had happened just the week before. Dolores developed a particularly poignant ritual. Every June 18th she made Jessica's favorite breakfast, huevos rancheros with refried beans and fresh tortillas, set it on the table as if her daughter might walk in at any moment, then sat in silence staring at Jessica's empty chair. Afterward, she carried the untouched meal to her parish to be given to a family in need. Anthony, for his part, continued traveling to Miami once a year, always in June, always hoping something had changed, that a new lead had surfaced. He walked the same streets Matthew and Jessica had walked in those final days, visited the Beacon Hotel, spoke with anyone who might remember a new detail. It was a painful ritual, but a necessary one. His way of staying connected to his missing children and of proving to himself that he hadn't given up. In 2018, 4 years after the disappearance, Anthony met a different kind of private investigator on one of these annual trips. His name was Marcus Thompson, a former Miami Beach police detective who now specialized in human trafficking cases. Thompson had spent over 20 years on the force and had been peripherally involved in the original investigation into Matthew and Jessica. He told Anthony something no other official had ever stated so directly, based on his experience and the precise characteristics of the couple's disappearance. There was a significant likelihood they had been taken by a trafficking network operating between South Florida and several Caribbean islands. "I don't want to give you false hope," Thompson said during their first meeting. "But I also don't want you to lose all hope, especially when victims are young and physically attractive like your kids. There's a chance they're alive, likely in a very difficult situation, possibly held against their will somewhere outside the United States." That possibility fundamentally shifted Anthony's perspective. For 4 years he had swung between the hope that his children would return unharmed and the dread that they had been killed. Now he understood a third possibility, one that was at once more hopeful and more horrifying: that they were alive, but trapped in a situation of exploitation. Thompson explained that the trafficking networks operating out of Miami maintained extensive connections in the Caribbean, particularly in places where law enforcement was patchier and victims could be hidden with little risk of discovery. These networks targeted tourists because, after a time, they were less likely to be searched for intensively, especially those from families with limited resources for international investigations. Armed with this new framework, Anthony expanded the search beyond Miami. He reached out to anti-trafficking organizations in the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and elsewhere in the Caribbean. He began collaborating with groups of families who had also lost loved ones to trafficking and educated himself on the tactics these networks used to keep victims invisible and unable to escape. In parallel, Jessica's family evolved their efforts. Dolores connected with Mexican organizations dealing with forced disappearances and learned investigative techniques applicable to cases that crossed borders. Patricia, Jessica's younger sister, completed her nursing degree and then chose to study social work, driven by her personal experience with trauma and loss. In 2019, 5 years after the disappearance, The two families made a joint decision that reflected both their relentless determination and their sober grasp of reality. They established a nonprofit, the Matthew and Jessica Foundation, dedicated to helping other families who had lost loved ones abroad and to raising awareness about the dangers of international human trafficking. The foundation began modestly in Anthony's living room, but slowly grew. They started receiving cases from other families in similar situations, offering guidance on navigating the U.S. legal system, organizing support groups for relatives of victims, and pressing Mexican authorities to improve consular protection protocols. Through this work, Anthony and Dolores met dozens of families who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances. They realized Matthew and Jessica's case was not unique, but part of a broader pattern of transnational crime that disproportionately affected young Latinos traveling in the United States. This realization was both devastating and empowering. Devastating because it confirmed their children had likely been caught up in something larger and more systematic than they'd first imagined. Empowering because it gave them a community that truly understood their pain and a platform to turn personal tragedy into a force for change. In 2020, 6 years after the disappearance, the COVID-19 pandemic temporarily paralyzed many search efforts. International travel became impossible, in-person meetings were suspended, and both official and private investigations were scaled back. For families already enduring years of frustration and uncertainty, this additional halt was especially hard. Yet the pandemic also offered an unexpected opportunity. With more time at home and heavier reliance on digital communication, Anthony and Dolores significantly expanded their online efforts. They built a more sophisticated website for the foundation, connected with international human rights organizations, and developed a volunteer network to help with translations, online research, and social outreach. During this period, they also began receiving occasional reports of people resembling Matthew or Jessica in various parts of the world. Tips came through the website, partner organizations, and individuals who had seen their photos in social campaigns. Every report required follow-up, verification, and often costly trips to investigate leads that almost always proved to be false alarms. Still, the families had learned that in disappearance cases, especially those involving trafficking, every lead had to be checked, no matter how unlikely. Thompson had explained that victims could be moved frequently, and that a single authentic sighting might be the only window to locate them before they were shifted again. In 2021, 7 years after the disappearance, something happened that renewed both families' hopes. Through their international network, they learned of a U.S. operation on a private island in the Bahamas that had rescued several dozen human trafficking victims, including some abducted years earlier from different parts of the United States. Although none of the rescued individuals were Matthew or Jessica, the operation confirmed many of the theories Thompson and others had put forward about criminal networks operating out of Miami. It also proved that kidnapped victims could be kept alive for years in conditions of slavery, which meant there was still a real chance Matthew and Jessica might be found alive. The operation provided new insight into the network's tactics. According to official reports, victims were frequently moved between locations to avoid detection, given false identities, and held in conditions that made escape or outside communication nearly impossible. Some had been in captivity for more than a decade before rescue. For Anthony and Dolores, this was both heartening and horrifying. The possibility that their children were alive after 7 years was what they had been yearning to hear, but the reality of what they might have endured was almost unbearable to contemplate. By late 2021, the families decided to hire a new investigative team, one specializing specifically in international trafficking cases with ties to the federal agencies involved in the Bahamas operation. This team was significantly more expensive than previous investigators and required further financial sacrifice from both families, but they believed it was their best chance yet at real results. The new team began work in early 2022, 8 years after the original disappearance. Their approach differed systematically from earlier efforts. Instead of focusing primarily on Miami and the surrounding area, they started from the premise that Matthew and Jessica had been transported out of the United States shortly after their abduction, and directed their efforts toward locations in the Caribbean and Central America where trafficking networks were known to operate. It was against this backdrop of renewed, intensified searching that the event occurred, which changed everything. After 8 years of desperate searching, hundreds of false leads and broken hopes, devastating financial sacrifice, and unimaginable emotional pain. Jessica Miller suddenly reappeared, walking the streets of San Diego with a boy who looked to be about 7 years old. But her return would not end the nightmare. It would mark the beginning of an even deeper, more disturbing mystery that challenged everything their families thought they understood about those 8 silent years. On April 23, 2022, exactly 7 years, 10 months and 5 days after Matthew and Jessica vanished in Miami, a phone call changed everything for the families who had lived in emotional limbo for nearly a decade. Anthony Carter was at his new job as a supervisor at a small auto shop on the outskirts of Phoenix when his cell phone rang at 11:34 a.m. The number flashing on Anthony's phone was unfamiliar. But after 8 long years, he had trained himself to answer every call, because any ring could be the one carrying news about his missing son. The voice on the other end was formal, professional, yet something in its tone sent Anthony's pulse racing. "Mr. Carter, this is Commander Raul Ellison with the California State Police, out of San Diego. I need you to sit down for what I'm about to tell you." Anthony's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Over the years, he had received hundreds of calls, some from investigators, some from strangers claiming to have seen Matthew and Jessica, many from scammers trying to exploit a grieving family. But something about this call felt different. "Yesterday afternoon," Commander Ellison continued, "one of our patrols came across a young woman walking through downtown San Diego, holding the hand of a boy about 7 years old. She appeared disoriented, malnourished, and dressed in tattered clothes. When officers approached to offer help, she broke down crying, repeating over and over, 'I need to get back to Phoenix. I need to find my family.'" Anthony gripped the phone, his knuckles white. "And what does this have to do with us, Commander?" "Mr. Carter," Ellison said carefully, "when we brought the woman to the station, we tried to identify her. We showed her photographs of people listed as missing. One of those photos was of your daughter-in-law, Jessica Miller." The woman began sobbing hysterically when she saw it and said, "That's me. That's me. But from before, from when I was happy." The world around Anthony stopped. For 8 years he had imagined this moment. He had dreamed of the day someone would call and tell him they had been found. But now that it was happening, he could barely process it. Are you sure it's her?" he whispered. "We verified her fingerprints with the ones on record from her passport. It is definitely Jessica Miller, Mr. Carter, but I need to prepare you for what you're going to hear. She's endured severe trauma. Physically, she looks much older than 8 years should account for. Emotionally, she's fragile. And the child with her, what about the boy?" Anthony interrupted. "He appears to be about 7 years old, Mr. Carter. And according to Jessica, in the rare, coherent moments she's had, he is her son." The word struck Anthony like a hammer to the chest. A 7-year-old boy meant he had been born during the years Jessica was missing. It meant she had carried a pregnancy in captivity, given birth under unimaginable conditions, and raised a child through trauma and danger. And Matthew? Anthony finally managed after a long silence. "Do you know anything about my son, Matthew?" The pause on the line was long enough for Anthony to know the answer would not be good. "Mr. Carter, Jessica hasn't been able to speak much about those years. She's in shock, severely undernourished, clearly suffering psychological trauma. But whenever we've mentioned Matthew's name, she breaks down and repeats, 'He couldn't come with me. He couldn't get out.'" Anthony closed his eyes as tears streamed down his face. For 8 years, he had held on to the hope that Matthew and Jessica would be found together, that their family would be whole again. But the commander's words suggested Matthew might not have survived, or at the very least, had not escaped with Jessica and the child. "Commander, I need to come to San Diego immediately. I have to see her. I have to talk to her." "Of course, Mr. Carter. In fact, we believe seeing family could help stabilize her emotionally. But I need you to prepare yourself. The woman you'll see is very different from the Jessica you knew. She's endured experiences that have fundamentally changed her. She will need time, patience, and professional psychological support to process what she's been through." After hanging up, Anthony immediately called his wife, Grace, to share the news. Her reaction was a storm of emotions. Overwhelming joy that Jessica was alive, but crushing despair at what this might mean for Matthew. His second call was to Dolores Miller, Jessica's mother. She collapsed in grief and relief so completely that her other children had to rush in to care for her. Within hours, The extended web of relatives, friends, private investigators, and members of the Foundation who had fought for answers over 8 years all knew. The news spread rapidly through social media and local outlets in Phoenix, sparking a mix of celebration and speculation about what had happened during Jessica's disappearance. That same night, Anthony, Grace, and Dolores boarded the first flight to San Diego. For the 3-hour trip, none of them ate or slept. Their minds were flooded with unanswered questions and the haunting image of what they might see when they finally laid eyes on Jessica again. They landed at 10:30 p.m. and were met by Commander Ellison, who escorted them directly to state police facilities. On the way, he explained how Jessica had been found. "We picked her up near the Mercado district downtown," he said. "She was walking aimlessly, holding the boy's hand. Several people called because she looked lost and the child terrified. At first, she resisted our officers, even tried to run, as if terrified of authorities." "How did she get here?" Dolores asked. "Do you know where she came from?" "That's one of the many questions we hope to answer in the coming days," Ellison replied. "She had no ID, no money, no luggage. It's as if she appeared from nowhere. The few details we've managed suggest she's been in multiple places over the past 8 years, possibly in several different countries." At the facility, they were taken to a comfortable waiting room. Ellison explained the protocol. Jessica is in a special room for trauma victims. A psychologist is with her, and the boy is asleep in an adjoining space. "We'll allow you to see her, but gradually and with great care. Her mental state is fragile. We can't risk adding more trauma." After 30 agonizing minutes, a psychologist entered. Middle-aged, calm. His name was Dr. Albert Monroe, a specialist in human trafficking survivors and severe trauma. "I want to prepare you for what you're going to see," he said gently. "Jessica has changed profoundly, physically and emotionally. She's lost a significant amount of weight. She has visible scars on her arms and hands, and she's developed defensive behaviors common among long-term captives. Most concerning are episodes of dissociation, where she slips out of the present reality. She whispers, glances constantly at doors as if expecting someone to come in, and panics at loud noises or sudden movements. The child shows signs of trauma as well, though he's more resilient because of his age. When they were finally led in, the woman waiting inside was almost unrecognizable. Jessica, once radiant and confident, now sat curled in a corner, knees hugged tightly to her chest, wearing clean clothes provided by authorities. Her hair, once carefully maintained, was long and unkempt, streaked with premature gray. Her skin bore the marks of prolonged sun exposure, but also the pale weakness of malnutrition. But it was her eyes that devastated her family most. The bright, expressive eyes they remembered were now haunted, distant, scanning every shadow as if danger lurked everywhere. When Dolores softly whispered, "Sweetheart, it's me, your mom," Jessica lifted her head. For the first time in minutes, her eyes focused. Then she began to sob from a place so deep it shook the room. "Mom," she whispered, I thought I'd never see you again. I thought I'd forgotten your face." The reunion was both tender and harrowing. Jessica let her mother embrace her, but her body stayed tense, alert, as though danger could strike at any second. When Anthony moved closer, she flinched until he spoke, and she recognized his voice. "Where's Matthew?" she asked, the first full sentence she managed. "He's here." "Waiting outside," Anthony answered instinctively. The silence that followed was crushing. Anthony knelt beside her and gently held her hands. "Jessica, we were hoping you would tell us. Matthew disappeared with you 8 years ago. We've been searching ever since." Confusion and pain crossed Jessica's face. 8 years? She repeated as if the words made no sense. 8 years. But my son Diego is 7. That means... She stopped abruptly as though she had said too much. For the first time, she confirmed the boy's name, Diego. For the first time, she confirmed directly that he was her child. "Where was Diego born?" Dolores asked softly. "Where have you been all these years?" Jessica began to shake violently. I can't talk about that now. They said if I talked, they'd come for him. They promised if I stayed silent, he would be safe. But I escaped. I had to. They were going to do terrible things." She broke off, paralyzed by the fear her silence had been conditioned to maintain. Dr. Monroe stepped forward gently. "Jessica, you're safe now. No one will hurt you or Diego, but it will take time before you feel that security again. You don't need to tell us everything tonight." At that moment, a cry echoed from the adjoining room. Diego had woken and noticed his mother was gone. Jessica bolted upright. "I need to be with him," she said urgently. "He gets scared if I'm not there. All these years it's only been me. He doesn't know anyone else." When Diego was brought in, Jessica's extended family saw him for the first time, the child whose very existence had been the most shocking revelation of all. He was small for his age, thin but not malnourished, with wide brown eyes strikingly similar to Matthew's. His hair was dark and curly, and his features carried an undeniable resemblance to his mother's Mexican heritage. What struck everyone most was his behavior. Diego clung to Jessica immediately, wrapping himself around her leg as if terrified she might disappear. He made no eye contact with any unfamiliar adult in the room, and when Dolores tried speaking gently to him in Spanish, he replied in what sounded like a blend of Spanish and English, suggesting he had grown up in a multilingual environment. "Diego, these are part of our family," Jessica told him softly, speaking Spanish that carried inflections hinting at other languages. "This lady is my mom, your grandma, and this gentleman is your dad's father." When she said, "your dad's father," Jessica looked straight at Anthony, and in her eyes he saw a deep, aching sorrow, and something that felt like a silent apology. It was as if she were trying to communicate something about Matthew she couldn't put into words, something too painful or too dangerous to say aloud. The first night in San Diego was long and difficult for everyone. Jessica and Diego were placed in a special suite at the state police facility, while Anthony, Grace, and Dolores stayed at a nearby hotel. None of them slept more than a few hours, processing the reality that after 8 years of desperate searching, they had found Jessica. And with that, had also confirmed their worst fears about Matthew. Over the next several days in San Diego, the slow process began of trying to reconstruct the 8 missing years of Jessica's life. It would be complicated by her severe trauma, by her evident fear of retaliation if she revealed too much, and by the presence of a child who had clearly witnessed things no child should ever see. But gradually, through careful conversations with specialized psychologists, fragments of a story emerged, a story more horrifying than any of them had imagined. A story that would explain not only where Jessica and Diego had been all those years, but what had really happened to Matthew Carter on those sunlit streets of Miami Beach in the summer of 2014. Those days became a painful, incremental reconstruction, where every fragment Jessica could share raised more questions than it answered. Dr. Albert Monroe established a careful therapeutic interview protocol, one designed to let Jessica process her trauma while still providing crucial information to authorities without re-traumatizing her. The first significant revelation came in the second session, when Jessica managed to talk about the immediate events after her disappearance in Miami. According to her account, halting, broken by long pauses and tears. She and Matthew were abducted while walking toward the port area of Miami Beach on June 18, 2014. "We were lost," she whispered. "We'd walked farther than we'd planned, and it was afternoon. It was so hot. And Matthew suggested we sit in the shade before we kept looking for the pier where they supposedly had info on snorkeling tours. They sat on a bench under trees in a less touristy area. Fewer people, fewer cameras. A man came up to us," she continued. "He was Latino, spoke Spanish with a Caribbean accent, and seemed very friendly. He said he'd seen us walking, said we looked lost, that he knew the area and could help. The man, who introduced himself as Carlos, offered them a ride to the pier to find tourist activities." "Matthew was hesitant," Jessica said. "He was always careful with strangers. But it was sweltering, and we'd been walking for hours. The man seemed genuinely kind, and I was exhausted. I told Matthew it seemed safe. Accepting help from a stranger would prove to be the decision that changed their lives completely. The vehicle was a large white van like those used for tour groups. Another man sat in the driver's seat. Carlos took the bench seat with them. At first, everything seemed normal. They chatted about Arizona, their trip, what they wanted to see in Miami. But after about 10 minutes, Carlos's questions turned more specific. Did anyone know exactly where they were that day? Had they made plans with other people? Were their families expecting to hear from them at a particular time? "That's when I started to feel something was wrong," Jessica said. But it was already too late. When she asked if they could head back to the hotel, Carlos calmly lifted his shirt to show a small handgun. He told them to cooperate and no one would get hurt. Matthew immediately shifted protectively, trying to put himself between Carlos and Jessica, but the driver pulled over, and he was armed too. The van took them to an industrial zone on the outskirts of Miami, far from tourist areas, to a warehouse that looked abandoned from the outside but had been retrofitted inside as a kind of temporary processing center. There were other people there, Jessica recalled, trembling. Other victims, mostly young. Some looked like they'd been there days or weeks. For the next 48 hours, Jessica and Matthew were held while their captors seemed to decide what to do with them. They separated us the first day, she said. Men on one side of the building, women on the other. I could only see Matthew at meals, and guards were always watching. He kept trying to communicate with looks and little gestures, promising we'd find a way out. During those first days, Jessica began to understand the organization that had taken them. She overheard guards talking about sending people to different places, some to work on fishing boats, others to farms, others to places she could not bear to describe. The decision about Jessica and Matthew came after men who seemed higher ranking arrived, better dressed, clearly in charge. They examined us like merchandise, Jessica said, asking about our education, skills, work experience. That was when they were told they'd be sent to different locations. They said Matthew would be sent to fishing operations somewhere in the Caribbean because he was strong and used to physical work. They told me I would go to do domestic service for a wealthy family on a private island. The separation was devastating for a couple married only a few months. Matthew fought the guards when he realized they would be split up. He offered money, begged them to keep them together, threatened that their families would pay any ransom. But the captors told them they were no longer tourists who could be ransomed. They were now property. The last time Jessica saw Matthew was in late June 2014, roughly a week after the initial abduction. They took him first, she said. I was in a room with other women when I heard his voice in the hallway, shouting my name, telling me he loved me, promising he'd find a way to come for me. That was the last time I heard him. Jessica was transported a few days later on a journey that lasted several days and involved multiple legs. They put me in another vehicle with 3 other women. We drove for many hours, stopping only for food and gas. Then we were on a small boat all night. By the time we reached the destination, I had no idea where I was. The destination turned out to be a private island in the Caribbean, where she was forced to work as a domestic for an extremely wealthy family who seemed to understand exactly how she had arrived. They had a massive estate with many employees who were clearly in the same situation I was, she said. Some had been there for years. Some were from different Latin American countries. In the first months, Jessica clung to the hope that Matthew would find her, or that they would somehow escape and reunite. But gradually she realized the island was completely isolated, with no way off without help, and that employees who tried to flee simply disappeared. In her second year on the island, Jessica discovered she was pregnant. I didn't know what to do, she said. I was terrified of what would happen when they found out, terrified of what it would mean for a baby to be born into that life. But he was the only part of Matthew I had left. It felt like keeping a piece of him with me. The pregnancy and Diego's birth changed her situation. The family had children and recognized Jessica's natural care for Diego. They assigned her tasks involving more interaction with their kids, which gave her slightly more freedom within the property. Over the following years, Jessica became an unofficial nanny for the family's children while secretly raising Diego. I had to keep him hidden most of the time, she said. They didn't want to be reminded that the household staff had their own lives and families. Some of the other workers helped me watch him when I had to work. Through those other employees, Jessica occasionally heard news from the outside. Some had managed secret contact with relatives. I learned our families were searching for us, that there had been publicity about our disappearance, she said. But I also learned Matthew had never been found. Hope of reuniting lingered for years, fed by rumors among staff about people being shuffled between different operations of the criminal network. New workers sometimes arrived from other islands or other forms of forced labor. I always asked if they'd met someone named Matthew, if they'd heard of fishing operations where he might be, she said. But as the years passed with no concrete news, she began to face the possibility that Matthew might not be alive. Stories circulated of workers who tried to escape, who became sick or injured, and simply vanished. I started to fear something terrible had happened to Matthew in those first years, she said. The chance to escape finally came in early 2022, when a chain of events created a window Jessica had not seen in nearly 8 years. The family she worked for ran into serious financial trouble. They began cutting staff, and some of the most experienced security guards were reassigned elsewhere. At the same time, a longtime employee, on the island for more than a decade, finally managed to establish contact with relatives off-island. Through this employee, Jessica sent a coded message to her family, the first in 8 years. I couldn't say where I was or give specifics, she said, but I sent a signal that I was alive and that I had a son. I hoped the message would reach them and somehow help them find me. Before any response could come back, circumstances on the island changed dramatically. Word spread that U.S. authorities had opened an investigation into the family employing them, tied to tax evasion and other financial crimes. The family panicked. They began making plans to abandon the island for good. And it was in that chaos, as belongings were packed up, staff shuffled, and the household emptied, that Jessica saw her chance. In the confusion, she later explained, I hid Diego and myself on one of the boats leaving the island. I didn't know where we were headed. I only knew it was our one chance to escape. The journey from that island to eventually reaching San Diego was long, complicated, and filled with peril. It involved multiple stops, strangers who helped them for reasons Jessica still didn't fully understand, and countless moments of danger where recapture seemed only seconds away. There were times Jessica thought they wouldn't make it, times she considered giving up because the journey felt too dangerous for Diego. But each time, she pictured her family, pictured Diego meeting his grandparents, and kept going. By the time they reached San Diego, they had been traveling for weeks, mostly at night, surviving on the kindness of strangers, constantly looking over their shoulders in fear that agents of their captors were still hunting them. When we got here, I didn't know what to do, Jessica admitted. I'd been gone from the U.S. for so long. Diego had no official documents. I was terrified to go to the authorities because I didn't know who I could trust. I was just walking the streets trying to figure out how to get back to Phoenix when the police found us. Even after providing these details about her lost 8 years, much of Jessica's story remained vague or incomplete. Whenever investigators pressed for specifics about the island's location or the identities of those in the criminal network, she grew evasive, her fear palpable. They promised if I ever talked, they'd come for Diego, she whispered in one session. They told me they had contacts in the U.S., that they could find anyone, anywhere. Even now, even here, I'm afraid they're still looking for us. Her lingering terror left investigators with limited information to pursue. It also meant that Matthew's fate remained uncertain. Jessica couldn't provide precise details about where he had been taken or which exact operation had claimed him. But in her 5th session with Dr. Monroe, Jessica finally revealed something that shifted everything. During my 3rd year on the island, she said, voice barely audible, a new worker arrived who had been in fishing operations around the Caribbean. One night, while sharing stories, I mentioned Matthew. He told me he remembered someone fitting his description, working on fishing boats near a place called Little Cayman. He said Matthew had last been seen about 2 years after the abduction, working under brutal conditions on boats in international waters between the Caymans and Jamaica. He told me Matthew had been planning an escape, but after that, no one ever saw him again. It was the first concrete lead on Matthew in years, but it also suggested a tragic fate. Forced labor in fishing fleets on international waters was infamous for its high death rates. If Matthew had attempted an escape and vanished, it was possible his plan had ended fatally. With this new information, Mexican authorities coordinated with international agencies to investigate the fishing operations Jessica described. For the first time in 8 years, the search had a direction: Little Cayman. It sparked the most intense investigation since the couple's disappearance. Commander Raul Ellison of the California State Police immediately worked with federal agencies and international partners to trace those operations. 3 weeks later, the investigation took a dramatic turn when Marcus Thompson, the private investigator long involved with the Carter family, received a call that would change everything. The man on the other end identified himself as Captain James Morrison, a retired U.S. Coast Guard officer who had followed the story in the news. I've been seeing the reports about the woman who turned up in San Diego, Morrison said. Something about the details feels familiar. I think I might know something about her husband, about what happened years ago. Morrison explained that in 2016, during his final years of active service, he had participated in a rescue operation in international waters near Little Cayman. We got a distress call from a fishing vessel reporting a man overboard. When we arrived, we found a Latino man floating in a makeshift raft. He was severely dehydrated, with clear signs of physical trauma. We brought him to a hospital in Grand Cayman, where he stayed in a coma for days before waking. And when he did, he insisted his name was Matthew Carter. He said he needed to contact his wife, Jessica, in the U.S. He spoke of Miami Beach, of being abducted on his honeymoon. But with no documents, and his story sounding so extreme, the doctors thought he might be delusional from trauma. Morrison remembered the case because of its unusual nature. The man had obvious scars from grueling labor at sea, was severely malnourished, and showed signs of deep psychological trauma. But he also possessed an extraordinary determination. Even in his weakened state, Morrison recalled, he kept repeating that he had to get back to the U.S. to find his wife. Records confirmed the rescue, August 14, 2016. Files included photographs of the rescued man. Though gaunt, scarred, and aged beyond his years, it was unmistakably Matthew Carter. When Anthony saw the photos, the emotional impact was overwhelming. He was clearly alive in 2016, Anthony said later. 2 years after he was taken. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 2 years. But his eyes, I could still see my son in his eyes. That determination never left him. Morrison went on to fill in missing pieces. According to what Matthew said in the hospital, he had been forced to work on different fishing boats for 2 years. He had attempted escape several times. The one that worked had been carefully planned for months, studying guard routines, mapping ocean currents, secretly building a raft from scraps. He waited for a stormy night with low visibility to make his move. After 3 days drifting at sea, he was found by the Coast Guard, barely alive, but conscious. His first words had been his full name and a plea to contact Mexican authorities about his missing wife. During his recovery, Matthew had provided detailed intelligence on the trafficking networks he had witnessed, names, locations, methods. It was a treasure trove of information, shared with multiple agencies. But Morrison revealed something else, something that shook the family to their core. Matthew didn't stay in the hospital for full treatment, Morrison explained. After about a week, once he regained enough strength, he insisted on leaving. He was convinced Jessica was still alive somewhere in the Caribbean. He refused repatriation to the U.S. or to call his family. He said he couldn't go home without her, that leaving without her would mean giving up. The Caymans gave him temporary documents and a little money, expecting him to return home safely. Instead, he used it to begin his own search across the islands. The last official record was from August 2016, when Matthew left the hospital. He had talked of taking odd jobs on different islands to move quietly and investigate the networks that might still be holding Jessica. He had chosen to continue the search from inside the same criminal world he had just escaped. For Anthony and Grace, the revelation was devastating and inspiring all at once. Their son had survived captivity, had escaped, and yet had chosen to risk his life again rather than return home without his wife. That's exactly who Matthew was, Anthony wept. He never gave up on the people he loved. He would rather die trying to find her than live knowing he'd left her behind. With Morrison's testimony, Thompson and authorities pieced together a clearer timeline. Matthew had been enslaved from June 2014 until August 2016. After that, he was free, but actively searching for Jessica across the Caribbean. Then came the most crucial detail. Before leaving the hospital, Matthew had entrusted Morrison with something, a letter he had written to Jessica during his recovery, along with notes on locations he planned to investigate. Morrison had held on to them for 6 years, waiting for either Matthew's return or contact from his family. The letter, written in Matthew's unmistakable hand, contained not only a raw, heartbreaking message of love to Jessica, but also detailed notes on trafficking networks and private island estates he suspected. When Jessica read the letter, she broke down. "He knew about the island," she whispered. In his notes, he mentions investigating domestic operations on private Caribbean estates. That was exactly where I was. He had found me. Or at least, he was so close. The letter also named contacts Matthew had made, workers who had once been enslaved and who secretly helped others escape. One name leapt out to Jessica, Eduardo, a man she herself had met. He had worked in transport for the organization and occasionally smuggled out messages. Patricio must have been working with him, Jessica said, trembling. I knew Eduardo. He helped me once. That means Matthew was close. He was so close. This was the first hard evidence that Matthew had been actively searching for Jessica and the very networks that had held her, and that his final disappearance might have occurred while planning or attempting a rescue. Thompson immediately contacted agencies across the Caribbean to follow the trail of names in Matthew's notes. After weeks of international investigation, they finally tracked down Eduardo, now living under a false identity in Jamaica. What he revealed next would change everything.